Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, Talent Hidden in Plain Sight, Identifying Great Talent in Unexpected Places. I'm Rob Urstein from the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University and Guild Education, and really excited to moderate this session with five amazing folks who you'll get to meet. And please use the chat function to ask questions, and the second half of this session, we're going to turn entirely to your questions. So the session's purpose, when it was conceived in what seems like a very different time, was to think about how can we identify and train talent from underserved communities to fill the millions of open jobs around the nation. And I recall that in February, when we were first meeting about this, we had about a 3.5% unemployment rate. Now we have about an 8.5% unemployment rate. And conditions have certainly changed. And all of our panelists today have had to think about and manage those and are continuing to think about them. So as a way of kind of getting in this conversation, I thought we'd really take kind of some quick snapshots in thinking about what this means from kind of the employer perspective and what we know and are hearing from employers about talent needs and how they're thinking about it, what we think about from the actual talent perspective and folks that are trying to get kind of skills and education to land them opportunities and positions, and then kind of broadly what we see from learning providers. And we have just a great group of people to cut in on that. So I thought I'd start with Jake and Molly and kind of ask you to talk a little bit about your program and kind of what you've seen, particularly in thinking about kind of labor market data and your relationship with employers about how the pandemic has changed opportunities for them and in turn, the talent that you're trying to work with.
Well, thanks, Rob. I guess I'll start first, Molly. So, Catalyte, our company is we're using software to transform talent. And so what we do is that we use AI and predictive analytics to find people who have a potential to become great software engineers. We then bring them into our company, hire them, retrain them to be engineers, and we put them to work delivering engineering for our clients all over the world. Today, what's changed in terms of employer environments is that we are now starting to see that really sort of be able to bring in a diverse tech talent pool has become a strategic priority for companies, right? Before, when we had sort of 3.5% unemployment, it was nice to have, right? You talked about it was really around sort of CSRs, around sort of feeling good about yourself. Today, I think companies are recognizing that they have to really engage in this process to bring diversity, to bring this different talent pool into their workforces. And what our technology does, it shows that talent and ability truly is evenly distributed. So as long as employers are engaging, they're now actually bringing in new technologies, trying different experiments to bring in a different pool of talent that they can go on to become top performers in their company.
I agree with that. I would say three things that we've noticed. Two are more on how companies are thinking about bringing talent on board. So absolutely agree. We're seeing a much greater focus on diversity and inclusion and equity from employers. I would say, I think there's still a lot of work to do on how that is done. What is the strategy? How do you make sure that you're really truly inclusive? But there's a lot of really promising interest. We haven't seen big movement on remote entry-level hiring, which is also a barrier. So I think that's a watch this space. I hope that changes because that is actually a really big barrier to the folks that we're working with, which are low wage working adults. And so they often have, other constraints around commutes, children, things like that. The third thing I'll say is more around demand, and maybe not surprisingly, because we're working with large tech companies, we saw a bit of uncertainty at first, and overall numbers are still lower than they would have been for 2020, but we're still seeing a lot of demand for open roles. So I would put it in the good category as far as the good, the bad, and the ugly from COVID. And it does really give me hope. Our goal is to enable $1 billion in wage gains for hardworking Americans Americans in the next 5 years. And given what we've seen this year, we'll take a slight hit on the numbers for this year, but actually the learnings from this year and what we're seeing from employer demand, it looks like we're on track, and that would be incredible.
And Molly, just so everyone knows, could you just briefly explain kind of Merit America's model?
Sure, absolutely. So as I said, we help low-wage workers get launched into tech careers by sourcing incredible overlooked talent, people without bachelors who are underemployed and unemployed. We provide rapid and flexible training. It used to be 85% online. It's now 100% online. That includes the support and coaching we provide. And then we work with employers, and we also provide independent placement to help them get a job. And the goal is to move them from, underemployment, feeling really stranded, to that first rung of the middle class ladder, or maybe even a few rungs up within a couple of months.
Great, thank you. So turning attention a little bit to learners, and I'd like to turn to Jerelyn and Eli, who both work in community-focused programs. Jerelyn with the Knowledge House in the Bronx, and Eli with Rivet School in Richmond, California. And I'd love to hear a little bit of what you've learned and what you've thought about from the perspective of individual learners in your programs and how things have impacted those programs, starting with Jerelyn.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. So the Knowledge House provides technology education programs to youth and young adults, primarily in the Bronx. And as you can imagine, since COVID, like most workforce development organizations, we've gone 100% virtual. So we provide coding and design job training at our office. And what makes us different is that to close the school to work pipeline, we work with both K through 12 and adult job seekers. And everything is online since March. We transitioned literally from Google Hangouts to Zoom because we're learning as we go, and our students are being really patient. Our job trainees today, most of them are saying that learning how to code virtually is actually pretty effective. However, 60% want some type of in-person engagement, whether it's on a monthly basis or weekly basis. And so even in the summer, we were trying to, transition to hybrid. But in New York City, for the first time in a while, the COVID rates have increased. And now we have to just think about what it looks like to be 100% virtual in the long run. Just to add on to Molly's point, we are also seeing a lot of interest from corporations, but it's mostly on the corporate volunteer side. So obviously after the death of George Floyd, a lot of these companies have made solidarity statements and diversity pledges, but we haven't seen employment outcomes yet, right? So we had an increase in volunteers wanting to engage with us, which is great, but we're waiting to see if employers actually walk the walk. And I'll just add, in terms of the demand, while our core job training focuses on high-tech skills, there's a lot of interest from workforce development organizations that provide construction or customer service training. And they're looking for digital skills training because everyone needs the basic tech skills. Everyone needs to learn how to use Zoom, So we've seen an increase in the demand for just general digital fluency skills. And so that allows us to be of service to our community.
Thanks, Jerelyn. Super interesting. Curious to follow up on more on that. On our side, as Rob mentioned, I'm a co-founder and co-executive director of Rivet School. We're a accelerated bachelor's degree program for working adults across California. And we help our students earn an accredited bachelor's degree in 2 to 3 years and for $10,000 or less total. Part of the impetus behind Rivet School is that there's an implicit expectation in kind of traditional higher ed, that particularly bachelor's oriented programs, that school, that you can be stable for and be able to kind of attend school for anywhere from 4 to 8 years to earn a degree. A fun fact, the average time to a bachelor's degree through the California State University system, through the community college route, average is over 6 years, closer to 7. And so please stop saying 4-year degrees. If you take anything away from my comments here, 4-year degree is just, it's not the right way to think about it. And so we created this accelerated bachelor's degree program to attack that problem. I think COVID has just magnified that challenge. You know, it's hard to plan, you know, 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, let alone a year or 2 ahead. And our students are already, you know, pre-COVID dealing with housing instability, with chaotic, you know, jobs and, you know, and chaotic job schedules with kids at home. And so, you know, the expectation that someone can, you know, stably and consistently be engaged in an education or training program, particularly the people in our country who need that support the most, is just unrealistic, to be generous, and potentially racist to be, you know, more real. You know, fundamentally, higher education is just not set up to deal and with this reality. To give just two specific examples, or maybe just one specific example. So much of what we see among our students is that in order to really get through a long-term program, they need to cycle in and out. You know, they'll have a month or two where they can make a lot of progress, then they need to pause and deal with something in their life, and maybe they'll come back. All of higher education is really only focused on supporting students who are actively enrolled in an academic program. There's no financial model to support a student who's not actively enrolled in your program. But, you know, we try, like our coaches work with students even when they're not actively enrolled in a term. But just to give you a sense of like what a fundamental challenge is in the kind of traditional higher education system, and one that you'd have to kind of attack if you wanted to fundamentally change outcomes, that's one that I'd point to and that we're seeing magnified now.
Thanks, Jerelyn and Eli. So Frank, you have a nationwide 30,000-foot view of lots of different learners and lots of different programs. It would be great to get your kind of snapshot on what you've been seeing and how you've been thinking about things.
Well, I think like every organization, when the pandemic hit, I mean, we were basically playing defense, trying to figure out what it meant to operate an 800-person remote workforce that, you know, the week before had been working just fine. I think as the fog lifted from how we were going to change how we operated, what we started to see as consumers started to find their new reality is that they needed to go back and learn new skills. You had 20 or 30 million people from hospitality, retail, airline sector and the like who were being displaced. And these are frontline workers, from baggage handlers to folks who work in front restaurant jobs, and they need to find alternatives. So we've seen a significant surge of demand from what you would consider as a Penn Foster target market, which is the middle skilled labor market, but you've seen it from different sources of supply than maybe historically have been the case. And what we've seen is that the profile of the learners that are coming to our institution are very diverse, not in just the classic definitions of diverse, because we've always served very diverse populations, but they're emanating from industries that for a long time were really not related to what we do. But the shift towards opportunities, particularly in allied health, has led to a significant interest in new frontline occupations. There are a lot of transferable skills across industries that, just because of the opaque aspect of skills, that one might not recognize. So a person who's a terrific frontline customer service person in the airline sector might be ideally suited, given their capabilities and empathy, to work in the allied health sector. But that historically hasn't been an option. So what we're seeing is lots of transfer of people from other non-traditional industries entering skilled trades, entering allied health, and really trying to take better control of their employment destiny. They realize that the market's shifting. The kind of programs they're looking for, of course, match a lot of what we stand for, which is certainly online, highly affordable, preference to avoid debt at all costs, because that's not necessarily a fair trade, taking on debt just to gain a skill, and just fundamentally flexibility to work around a very different life model that everyone's navigating through. So we've seen, after disruption, a real strengthening of the market. We think it's a secular trend, and votes are rising in the sector, meaning lots of the organizations that we hold in a very high regard are similarly having very similar experiences. And so we've tried to go on offense to make sure we have the right kind of programs and the right kind of support for people. as they're navigating, significant uncertainty. So you have a confluence of a recession, which historically means counter-cyclical demand for the education sector, and the pandemic, and the disruption of the labor market all happening simultaneously. And we are seeing just more appetite. There's a famous line about recessions and kind of crisis like pandemics where it just accelerates what would have inevitably happened anyway. And I think what we've just experienced is that 3 to 5 years in the future just arrived in 2020, and we're doing all that we can to make sure that we can be as supportive as we can to people who have a lot of unique challenges, and frankly, some really exciting, unique opportunities in their career paths.
Thanks, Frank. Since one of the kind of areas that we really wanted to focus on in this session was really speaking about talent that is located in underserved communities, to what extent has access been an issue as everything has flipped online for your programs and your learners?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just to further unpack that, there are many dimensions of how to think about us. One would be an industry dimension, where we serve industries like allied health and skilled trades. A second dimension is the type of school we have. So we have a fully accredited high school, career school, then associate degrees. What we've seen is that the high school, which is, by the way, very focused on adults, well, we do have some traditional age students, but we're mostly focused on adults, they seem to be the group more than any other that struggle with access. It presumably correlates to income and perhaps geography to a lesser degree, but we do find that to be a very significant challenge, and we're trying to take steps that we can to help level our basic theory is the case of most of the people in this call today, are that opportunity is not equally distributed, and talent is. So we're trying to tap into that notion that zip code shouldn't define your destiny, and we're encountering lots of turbulence. Access in the traditional internet sense is only one dimension of it. It has gotten harder though, because the traditional places they'd go to get free Wi-Fi are shut down. You can't go sit in the Starbucks, you can't go sit in the McDonald's, and even the public libraries are obviously very constrained. So there is a structural dynamic to people being able to adopt online programs for particularly in second tier markets, and frankly for people who are lower income. And that's a very real challenge. But there are lots of other challenges. Access to different kinds of social services is essential. Different kind of financial services, financial literacy is almost as acute a problem as access to technology, because people don't fully understand or haven't been provided the access and opportunity to understand the economics of going to school and why that's so fundamental to growing their long-term economic prospects. Folks like us likely take that for granted, but fundamental access to the internet is certainly one of the top 3 challenges for sure.
Thanks, and I like the way you broaden that out to think about lots of dimensions of access beyond just broadband access. But I'm curious for others on the panel, how kind of they've thought about access, or what kind of the pandemic has revealed about access as another obstacle for their programs and their program participants.
We've definitely, we do a survey for our learners, and we've seen a couple of things. So one, on technology, there's about 10 to 15% of our learners that just don't have access to, usually it's not even just internet, it's actually just a computer, or they have one computer for the household and their kid is doing virtual learning. And as Frank said, we used to send them to the public library. That's not an option anymore. So we've seen a real constraint there. We've also seen financial constraints. We actually started a micro grant resiliency fund for some people that, and I would say this is kind of broader access. Some of it is unexpected, having to take care of, not just children, but parents, for example. They just, they're carrying a lot, and they're carrying more now than ever. And then the third bucket is more psychological. The interesting thing when we asked about effects from COVID, by far the largest, and I can't remember exactly how we phrased it, but it was essentially mental health and psychological stress. And we definitely hear that, from our coaches, and our learners are expressing it, that just there's a lot going on, and they just feel like they are carrying more now. And so the need for additional support and, wraparound services is that much greater. It's also that much more challenging to provide. One, because all those services are overloaded, and two, because there's the virtual element. How well can you provide any of those remotely?
I'd love to add to that. I'll just share one example of a learning that we had over the summer. At first, we thought that the main barrier would be like laptop access, and so we tried our best to literally, my co-founder was delivering loaner laptops to our students on his bike. And then a few months into the program, we just realized we needed to start with MiFis and like Wi-Fi access, because even though we were able to match all of our students with a laptop, imagine when you have 5 devices, right? Phones and laptops connected to the Wi-Fi, you have limited bandwidth, right? And then over the summer, we were trying to get virtual case management right. And we were trying to figure out how come some students have both their audio and their video muted 100% of the time. And at first we thought they're disengaged, they're not doing their work, they're not participating. And we just had to step back because we just realized, no, they're just trying to save their bandwidth. They're just turning off their video so that they can actually stay connected, right? Furthermore, we had to think about the household makeup of our students, right? In a situation where there's 5 devices eating up the Wi-Fi, there are multiple people in that household, right? So our students live in multi-generational households, and it's a 2-bedroom apartment, sometimes 1-bedroom apartment. So not only are they muting their videos to save bandwidth, but they probably have kids in the background, or they probably have siblings watching TV in the background, and they don't want to expose what goes on in their household to the rest of the class. So it was as we started talking about access, we just had to now think about household makeup, things that we usually don't think about when our students are coming to in-person class. And so we had to really pay attention to mental health and wraparound services, as Molly said. It was crucial.
I would just build on that, just to move to the provider side. We've introduced new mental health services to our employees, and we're trying to change the conversation to make anxiety and mental health a natural part of just the reality of our world, and not make it something that a person lives with but is secret. Now, everyone has their own levels of disclosures, and everyone has their own demons, as we say, and we're not unique in that respect. But we have to make it more acceptable to talk about the realities that we're living in a very complicated time, and that there are lots of risk factors that you can ignore or you can try to elevate. It's not to say you have to necessarily talk with your boss about it, but you have to make it something that's discussable. And we're working hard. And the reason that's important, to pick up on her point, is those are the same people who are interfacing with our students. And our customer service people who used to work in our office are now working at home. And they too live in multi-generational families. And they're trying to do their job where they're answering phones and trying to be responsive to students. And so we've had to really think deeply about makeup of the homes of our workers as much as the makeup and home of our students. And I think you have to embrace both. Maybe the solutions are a little different because of the scale, but it's a very real issue that affects the overall experience for the learner and obviously correspondingly the employee.
I wanted to add a couple of observations, one very kind of on the student level, and then one a little bit more in the sky, but I think hopefully useful and important. On the student level, I'm just looking at the list. We have an emergency fund that students can apply to. I'm looking at the list of recent applications, and just to give a sense of kind of what real students are dealing with, medical stuff, lost a job, unexpected flood in the house, car broke down, gap in medical insurance, laid off from job, facing eviction, and this is not like 1 or 2 students. It's everyone basically is having these issues. And I mention this not just to kind of share the real and the tough stories, but also because our emergency grants are $250 max per student per term. We do provide free laptops. We provide a $50 material stipend each term. But our operating model, we're a nonprofit. We're an earned revenue nonprofit. We basically can spend around $3,000 to $3,500 a year on a student. We can't solve the gaps of the social safety net. We can't solve fundamental problems of poverty and housing of unaffordability And it's not reasonable for any educational institution, frankly, to solve it. But in order to do the work to really, and at 3.5% unemployment, particularly at 8% unemployment, to move someone from being in a spot where they're really struggling to being really stable and on a path toward opportunity, it's not just one thing. They're like 10 things, 20 things. And it's just really hard. And it's not very solutions oriented, but that's the reality. The other thing I'd say is just from the student perspective, there's a lot of talk about college wage premium and, how much is college worth, and similar conversations around credentialing programs, although less research there. I'm not going to get the exact number, but I think it was one of the Federal Reserve offices did a study where they tried to produce this as an annualized kind of return number. And I think they gave like 10 to 15% annualized return is like an average college wage premium, which, if you're like a retail investor investing in the stock market, you take that any day of the week, guaranteed over the course of your life. We ask our students as part of some research we're doing, basically what their discount rate is. And I created the buckets for students to respond to that question, and they capped out at 25 or maybe 30%. I thought that would be enough. Literally every student who responds says their discount rate is over 30%. And it's phrased as basically, what's the minimum amount of money I'd have to give you in a year as opposed to taking a certain amount of money today. And what that means is that I think there can be a million great training opportunities, including bachelor's degree programs, credentialing programs for students. But if your discount rate's 30%, like you're not even thinking about a world in which you're enrolling in a program for a lot of students that might have significant benefits over the course of your careers if you're dealing with some of the issues that I mentioned. So that's kind of what we're saying in part.
I would say we have the same thing. I just want to, double down on that. Like we've seen we've seen learners become homeless increasingly. That happened before, but it's definitely been accelerated. And there's all kinds of things that, again, we as a nonprofit and, our work is mainly trying to get people from struggling low wage into stable, path to middle class. We know we can knock that out of the park. We are not, a social safety net. We're not experts on affordable housing or on mental health or any of that. And we've been trying to form partnerships with people who are, but I will definitely say that we're seeing a lot of cracks. And even, some of the people applied said, I should be eligible, but I just can't reach anyone at my, local office to get unemployment or to get, I still haven't gotten my stipend check, various cracks that just make it that much harder to get through. And our program is, rapid, but even, a couple of months is a lot when you're bearing the burden of all of that.
We had a question from the audience. Beyond hiring staff with a similar background, how do you help your staff build better empathy for the multiple issues your students face? How do you decide the topics on which you can train a generalist or when you may need to hire for wraparound services?
I think this is part of what I was getting at of we're not experts on this, and it's a lot to ask of a career coach. Some of them do have social work backgrounds, but it's just we can't expect them to be stretched across all of those. So we are highly prioritized.
Molly, you just cut out for me.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay.
Maybe I can, as Molly gets online here, let me just maybe build on her good point. I
Sure.
think that any institution has to make the most important decision of all, which is what's the culture of their firm. And the culture will set who you hire, who decides to stay, who grows and the like. And if you're in a learner-facing oriented organization, as most of us are, that will fully transfer out. So who you are internally becomes who you are in the learner experience. We've tried to create a culture that has a set of values that make the people who work at our institution, particularly those who are student-facing, feel like they have people who have their back and that they acknowledge that people are imperfect. the market that we serve, the so-called middle skill labor market, historically has been written off by many of the experts. And when they do engage them, they do it with a certain level of skepticism. Our first principle is affirmation, that we assume that these folks are just as talented as anybody who works in our organization. They have unique challenges and opportunities. And we start with the premise of everyone has genius, everyone has talent, everyone has capability and potential. And it's our job to help them find that. And I think when you treat people with that basic notion, it's amazing what happens. There's a crisis of competence academically in the country, but for our students, the bigger crisis is one of competence. And we actually have a role to play in helping to affirm that, because the traditional education system has told them they aren't up to the task, and we just reject that. We just think that the system wasn't well contoured to meet their needs, and just the very act of empathy has a high signaling effect. And it's amazing what people who were the day before ordinary can become quite extraordinary just because they feel like someone has their back.
So you've all kind of acknowledged in both the architecture of your program, some of the things you've said today, something that I think we all understand deeply, which is that talent is dispersed, but opportunity isn't. And yet you're all essentially in the business of training people with skills. As you think of kind of challenges and obstacles, do you think of these primarily as challenges of skills and lack of skills, or are these problems primarily of opportunity? Is it a combination of both? How do you kind of juggle those two things as you think about better serving the students and communities you're serving?
I can speak to this. I mean, I think, and probably what Catalyte is a little bit different from the other panels here is that we're really kind of an employer-driven model. So our model actually begins with opportunity. So we actually work with large organizations to help them build a talent pipeline for those most in-demand tech careers, mostly software developers, data engineers, DevOps, et cetera. Now, what's different about our model, right, is that if you look at sort of the world of training, it's all based on skills. And the reality is that, especially in technology, skills are transitory, right? We kind of look at what we're doing as the next evolution of skills-based hiring, where you're really talking about evolving skill sets over time, right? Your rockstar Python developer today is not necessarily going to be your best engineer 3 years down the line, because the average tech platform has a 3-year shelf life. What we've discovered through data science is that when you look at sort of consistent top performers over time in terms of engineers, and by the way, we have over 1,000 alumni now through our program. We have over 24 CIOs and CTOs, and these are people who may have been baristas and working in fast food restaurants before, right? But they've been able to reach the pinnacle of those careers because it's really about underlying behaviors, right? What actually drives long-term performance and success isn't can you code in a particular language. It's actually professional behaviors like, do you deliver code quality consistently, right? Do you actually meet your sprint commitments consistently? There are other things like, for example, you think about teamwork. Well, how do you actually measure teamwork, right? How do you teach people to help solve other people's blocking requests, right? How do you help people to respond quickly on Slack channels? Or even something like stakeholder satisfaction, right? How do you enable your developers to be able to respond appropriately to unreasonable stakeholder requests? These are the actual professional skills that actually ensure long-term success. And so at the outside, when I was talking about sort of the need for employers to engage in this process, is a lot of those skills cannot be delivered in a classroom. I can't simulate stakeholder satisfaction in a classroom. It has to be delivered in the flow of the work. So a big part of what we've been refining in our technology is enabling the managers of people who are hiring apprentices, the coaches, to actually effectively deliver real-time performance precision feedback to people to continually moving them up that curve. But what you can find today, and ultimately I think this is sort of the code that needs to be cracked, is to really help employers understand there's a tremendous ROI here, right? And we've actually shown right now, especially in this time frame, it's a huge opportunity for all of us in this space, because suddenly you've got sort of the constraints coming from supply, because we've got this anti-globalization trend happening in the country. You've got sort of this really difficult time. Companies cannot do campus recruiting anymore, right? So we've actually activated a ton of sort of new accounts because companies are realizing we need to have a different model for recruiting entry-level labor. right? Entry-level tech jobs. So there's lots of new models from contract to hire to apprentices that are all being experimented with. But ultimately, it really comes down to sort of how do we actually enable this workforce with those long-term drivers of success. I think so much of what we've done as an industry has done has really been focused on transitory tech skills. And as we know, most of the times today, when people get out of school, those skills have already expired.
I think it's absolutely, opportunity. And can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I think employers are still, we work with employers, and a lot of what we're doing is getting them to look beyond the proxies, right? A bachelor's is a proxy. And if you put that as a requirement, you're eliminating 90% of Latinx. I think it's 85% of African-American males. But it's a legal way to screen people out. And honestly, it's easy. So what we're trying to do is say, we absolutely believe it's confidence building. The things we hear from our learners are the soft skills and the confidence training that we provide, and the cohort that we put them into where they can see other people like themselves and then see their successes is the biggest part. We do also do the hard skills because it's a way for employers to gain comfort, honestly. And a lot of it is just getting them to the point where you can say, this is absolutely, this is not some trick. And actually, it's much broader than you think. This isn't just some diamond in the rough, right? Or rather, perhaps we're in a diamond mine. There's so much more talent out there than you've seen because you're looking at, these proxies essentially for wealth, right? And your socioeconomic background instead of looking at what they can actually do. And so I think it's a lot about the opportunity. I do think for our learners, a lot of it is building up the confidence to where they can convey that and they can see themselves.
I always say the irony I've always found, especially the tech industry, is that, there's really they also use some of those same proxies. And the irony is that, Apple would never hire a Steve Jobs or a Steve Wozniak today. They'd be disqualified from some resume screen, right? Facebook would never hire Mark Zuckerberg, right? Oracle would never hire a pre-med dropout named Larry Ellison, right? So if you think about the modern product or engineering organization, how many of them actually have some of these sort of geniuses, these people who went on to become titans of the industry? And it's because, again, we've all relied on these very short-term, sort of very myopic proxies for determining if you're qualified.
So,
Rob, I was going to maybe just build on one other dimension, which we haven't really covered, if you think this is a fruitful line of questioning. But one of the other dynamics is you've had this surge of demand as folks have sought new opportunities, particularly in the middle skilled labor market or and in that context, what they have discovered is there really isn't enough capacity to support the surge of people coming into the system. Now, on one level, you might say there's ample capacity because there's public organizations like community colleges and the like, but it's not just a question of having capacity, it's got to be the right product market fit. And one of the organization or types of players in the mix that has really awoken, at least in our experience, has been the capital providers. Historically, if you looked at the flow of dollars into the education sector from private equity and venture capital, it's been mostly focused on K-12 and higher ed, 90% of it, and it's still very low compared to other sectors like healthcare, for example. But what we've seen in this middle skill conversation is particularly as social impact funds are growing and ESG is becoming such an important topic and way investors think about their deployment of capital, that we're finding is there's a bit of an awakening that this middle skill labor market, which is half of the workforce in the United States, really doesn't have the right types of solutions to meet their needs. And so what we're seeing is significant interest in the private equity industry to deploy their dry powder against helping this middle skill cohort to complement the traditional dollars that were deployed against K-12 and higher ed. And that's important because when there's capital, that attracts talent, it attracts entrepreneurs. And so I think we're at the beginning of a next kind of revolution of the middle skill labor market, where there'll be a new portfolio of providers that come to bear to try to provide better alternatives to the solutions that exist today. We're obviously an example of a firm trying to do that, but we're only one firm, and there's lots of other great organizations out there trying to crack the code. But I think if we were to have the same meeting in 3 or 5 years, I think you'll see a acceleration of entrepreneurship because of the capital allocation to the middle skill labor market in the same way you saw over the last several decades, the same dynamic in K-12 and higher ed. And that's good news for the consumer, right? Because then they have better options and they can take advantage of solutions that better meet their needs in different kinds of ways with different kind of modalities. And I think that it's a market that's underserved at a time when there's never been more need for it.
I just want to add, just to back up most of those points, I know that opportunity is what prevents our students from getting those jobs that they want to get, because if it were up to my students, most of them would have college degrees, right? 90% of the students at the Knowledge House dropped out or stopped out of college. And so college was not set up to make them successful graduates, whether it's, you know, the cost mainly, right? Like they stop out because of the cost. And so I'm really hopeful that we're not thinking about alternative pathways as the solution. It's literally just nonlinear pathways, period, because my students are in and out of college all the time. And so I need to actually go back and help them codify what they learned in college so that they can tell their future employers, I don't have a college degree, but I do have the social capital that a college graduate, you know, gained from that experience, right? Or I do have some college credits, so this is what I learned. You should give me a shot. So I just hope that becomes the new normal, really.
Thanks, Jerelyn. So we're actually at the end of our session. So I wanted to thank Eli, Jake, Frank, Molly, and Jerelyn, and thank everyone who tuned in. This has been a really important conversation, and I certainly learned a lot, and it was great to spend part of the day with all of you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Rob.
Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Lots of fun.
Bye.